Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and in the next batch of 11.25, Blizzard is looking to experiment with new ways for you to be able to experience the open world content as well as questing and leveling within War Within through the newest feature of Legion Remix called Heroic World Tier. A new form of a difficulty mode increase for anything that is open world content, so think of things like questing, a world quest, slaying rares, hunting for treasures, or potentially fighting world bosses. Yeah, all of those pieces of content are getting turned up to an 11, both in difficulty, but also both with the rewards as well. And so far, over these past weeks, since we had an extension to the duration of Legion Remix experience over in the PTR, and after spending numerous hours leveling a character as well exploring the endgame content for max level players through Heroic World Tier, I actually really fell in love with the system. And I think they should probably make this a staple of WoW in the future. Honestly, this should be available in Midnight or potentially at some point later down the line, because I actually think this adds so much more enjoyment to the open world experience. So for today's video, I really want to dive deep into what Heroic World Tier has to offer in terms of its benefits, rewards, as well as challenges. With that being said, as always, if you guys want to see more regular updates for War Within, such as content such as Legion Remix, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. But otherwise, let's dive right in. So the Heroic World Tier is going to be one of the new ways that you'll be able to level up and experience open world activities in Legion Remix specifically. This is a brand new feature that is being really experimental, essentially since, you know, the Bronze Dragonflight, or rather the Infinite Dragonflight, are involved in this entire Legion Remix as like their own personal project. They're able to do some fun, timey-wimey stuff, and they're able to simulate a world where Legion, instead of losing and eventually got beaten, was like a lot more threatening and potentially even won, allowing you to experience like an alternate version of Legion where you still can play all the same storylines and quest lines and experience the open world content, but everything is scarier, everything has a bit of this demonic influence, and things are a little bit tougher, especially demons, to fight back up against. So it's kind of like a new take of an experimental system, very similar to the Diablo games, inspired by their world tier system, which essentially increases the difficulty of not only open world content, but like all content in general. But it's an increased difficulty, but also an increased reward to follow it as well. And some of the different rewards, which I'll go talking about more in detail, will be things like faster leveling rates, as well as additional gearing opportunities. But again, I'll talk about the actual reward structure when we get to that a little bit down the line. I first want to cover the basics of this fun system. So if you're on PTR right now and you want to experience the Heroic World Tier in Legion, you'll see this massive console, this massive spiral fell, which is the console of infinite chaos that allows you to enable or disable the Heroic World Tier, which sets the state of the world to be very similar to that of War Mode. Like you just saw me phase back into the normal world where more of the casual audience of PTR are just casually questing, experiencing the PTR, having some fun, you know, taking it easy. It's kind of like turning on War Mode, but instead of making other players hostile to you, it makes the world more hostile in a sense. It is a pretty big transformative change, and you can see how the sky is nice and bright, everything looks very happy, very exciting, but as soon as you interact with this system, which allows you to enter World Tier, it's going to change the world into a more difficult version when it doesn't bug out on me like it did there. But yeah, and it also gives you a nice little debuff on the right hand side, Heroic World Tier. And when you're out in the open world, it used to be a big icon here, but I think they shifted it as just a buff in the buff window now, but it used to just have a different look to it. To enable this system, however, you will need to have at least a level 10 character to activate it. However, if you talk to the NPCs before you activate it, some of them will tell you that, hey, the Heroic World Tier is very deadly, very scary. You will actually recommended by NPCs to potentially enable it at level 25 so that you're better prepared. It doesn't stop you at just like trying to make the world a little bit more difficult. You're more than welcome to do so, but the NPCs are going to tell you, hey, prepare for this as things are going to get a little bit rougher. However, you could always, let's say you're away from this main bazaar area and you want to leave the Heroic World Tier, you'll have a special button that gives you a temporal retreat, and after 10 seconds it'll just return you back to the normal world tier. So if you are out in the open world and you're struggling with some rares, struggling with some quests, struggling with any of the open world activities, you can just turn it off. So it is something that you can opt into, but it's something you could pull out of anytime you want to. So there isn't really any big like sacrifice or commitment with the system. It's something that you could choose to engage with or not engage with at all. However, the benefits of engaging with the system are actually quite awesome. Now, out in the open world, once you enable Heroic World Tier, this feature will cause all mobs in the open world, essentially, to have increased difficulty. Level scaling will still affect your experience, so early levels, like mobs won't be scaled nearly as heavily. So as you're first starting out between level 10 to 20 to 30, as you're making your way through levels, as you're getting more talent points, mobs are not going to be, the level scaling is still going to mean that mobs are not just going to be obliterating you and one-shotting you immediately. They're going to get much tougher, but as you get to higher levels, it will mean that gear will become a lot more important in the higher levels. But early on, without having the best items, as long as you have a pretty good mechanical skill of your class, you should be for the most part good to go. But besides this, in the open world, with the system, enemies will have more health. They also will do more damage, and in some cases, pulling too many enemies together can pose now a significant challenge compared to, let's say, leveling in live realms for the War Within, for instance. However, from my experience, pulling one enemy at a time or like a few that you can take care of feels pretty comfortable. It doesn't feel like the fights last too long. They can be a little bit more engaging if enemies have more mechanics, but it's not too bad. You're just probably not going to be pulling like half the zone when you're questing with the system on. Elites and rares do feel more deadly for multiple reasons, but because they have more health and more damage, all of their mechanics become that much more important for you to pay attention to. Speaking of which, mechanics from mobs and most of the enemies out in the system are a lot more important with heroic mode or heroic world tier active. So enemies that have a cleave or a frontal or a cast that can be interrupted, some kind of an AoE effect that can be sidestepped, buffs that can be purged, debuffs that can be dispelled. All of those mechanics that have a way for you to be able to counteract and avoid them, or I guess dodge them in some cases, all of those become a lot more important. So if a mob has a cleave, but you become stationary and it's something you can sidestep, you should be sidestepping in world tier, because if you're not, it could potentially one-shot you. All those mechanics do hit very, very hard, which is why pulling as little mobs as possible that you're comfortable with makes all those encounters much, much easier. But if you pull half an area with every single like 20 mobs available at once, all those mechanics are easily going to be very overwhelming, very similar to how they work in like M+. However, when you're making content more difficult, you also gotta compensate players fairly with the rewards within this new leveling system. An early version of the world tier was not really that good at rewarding players, but they've since reward that reward structure, which you got to mess around with at early levels, but also at max levels as well. And these are the current rewards when you do play out in the world tier for heroic difficulty. First of all, leveling players will get 500% more EXP from slaying mobs. So you're looking at a much more rapid leveling pace. On live, for example, like let's say you're leveling through Kazalgar and War Within zones, you're basically trying to do as many big pulls as possible, mass AoE damage, speed running throughout quest to quest in order to collect as much XP as possible, but you're not really trying to slow down. None of the mobs are really all that scary or difficult. On Legion Remix, however, with the heroic world tier active, you are having a slower pacing for the actual combat and quests. You're doing smaller pulls, more intimate encounters of maybe 1 or 2 mobs, because pulling more than that could potentially put you in danger or possibly just cause a death too early. You can go for a slightly more safer approach, because pulling way too many enemies with affixes likely just means you have to run back to your body all over again. However, the danger of death, while it does exist, you are making much more steady progress. Where I'm able to, let's say if I'm leveling through less area level through this high mountain, and I was hanging around like a little bit near the river band area, there's a variety of different quests here, kind of under the True Shot Lodge in that cavernous area. I'm just able to collect like maybe a level over here, a couple of levels this way, and I'm doing the cave area, and I'm also getting levels there. So like you're able to get multiple levels just for staying within a very small area, completing quests and slaying mobs, so your XP rates are ridiculously high within the small time you spend with barely leaving a small condensed area of quests. it is a ridiculously fast-paced leveling for the time spent. It feels like your progress is slow, but the amount of XP you gain for every single encounter, for every single fight, is more than worth it. At least it feels more than worth it right now on the PTR realms, which in a way allows the game to reward you for some slow, methodical gameplay where you're taking mobs one by one, trying to be very careful. Mobs definitely do hit hard, but if you're able to defeat them little by little, one by one, you're able to make so much more of a pair level progress than you would, let's say, just leveling through Kazalgar areas. And it's actually really nice and kind of a breath of fresh air to some degree. In Legion Remix, mobs also do drop more rewards. They'll drop more bronze as well as infinite power in this heroic world tier difficulty. So basically, just like mobs, especially rares, you get much better drops for rewards. There isn't really any way that I can compare this to, let's say, leveling and killing mobs in Kazalgar and War Within, because Legion Remix uses its own feature of unique currencies to power up your artifact weapon, as well as a currency for transmog collection. But I think it'll be very, very similar to if, let's say, mobs in War Within were a lot more harder hitting, but every time you killed some very difficult mobs, it would drop you a little bit of Valor Stones, maybe even a crest or two, potentially even some decent reagents or some more gold than they usually would. So it takes you longer to take down basic enemies. They are a lot more challenging, but the rewards are much greater. So even if you're killing them slowly, you're still getting quite a decent bit of overall currency for the effort and the time spent. That's like the best way that I could be able to compare this, but it definitely does feel very, very rewarding within the system, or the ecosystem, closed ecosystem of Legion Remix for the moment. At max level, this is where things get interesting because you don't really need any more EXP. You have all the XP in the world and you're just trying to get as much gear as possible. And you can actually start to collect raid gear without ever having to step a foot into a raid. While Heroic World Tier is enabled, infinite caches, which you get in from majority of quest turn-ins as well as the world quests, you will have a chance to drop Corrupted Thorns of Dream. This is a currency or a reagent, I guess, in a sense. This is an item that you can combine together, 10 of them in particular, to create raid gear for the current raid tier. And right now in Legion Remix, under the update of Skies of Fire, it is Emerald Nightmare gear. And I mean best in slot gear at the moment, like literally top of the line, best of the best gear that could come from open world activities. Rares and certain elite enemies also have a chance to drop more of these thorns, so as you're out exploring the open world at max level, you're able to get these components that eventually become raid quality gear for a max level character, which is a compensation for rares and enemies being a lot tougher, taking a lot longer for you to take him down. But when you do take him down, you're rewarded with some actual sizable loot that could then be used with the rest of open world content. However, if that's not rewarding enough, for completing 100 world quests while Heroic World Tier is active, and Legion Remix also awards you some transmog gear, specifically the Sargeras Commander's Void Scarred Regalia. This is a purple, void themed version of the fel green version of the Regalia, the Sargeras Commander set. So this is something that is awarded directly from completing open world activities, specifically world quests. So you're rewarded with a cyclic transmog that has so many different cool components, from the cloak that has all these purple flames, as well as a pop color, the armor itself, which has this demonic meta look about it, all the different pieces, the pants, the legs, the belt, the chest, the shoulders, all of those. This cyclic set can be yours just for enabling open world Heroic World Tier and just doing world quests. Lastly, and I think this is just a nice bonus, but I definitely felt a more fulfilling feeling of doing open world content while the Heroic Tier was active. And let me explain this. I ended up experiencing a little bit better feeling of like accomplishment just doing open world content with this difficulty turned on. Very similar to a classic World of Warcraft, how the open world can be a little bit, it's vast and exciting, but also can be really tough if you're not prepared for it. But good preparation and good setup and careful play is very much rewarded towards the player. Naturally, smaller encounters are encouraged because they're going to be a little bit, easier, because pulling too many mobs is going to guarantee a death. But if you are able to defeat a smaller encounter, which feel a little bit more engaging, a little bit more intimate, the player is actually adequately rewarded for it. And careful play being rewarded, I think it's a good change of pace compared to how we usually play the game, which is just pull as many mobs as you can and nuke it down within a handful of seconds. I also think this mode could be a great player learning experience, as players are forced to some degree to learn how to properly play their class, use offensive abilities, crowd control, like to disable certain affixes, for instance, defensives for survivability, and of course mobility, like if you ever get in a really tough situation, accidentally pull too many mobs, good mobility can let you escape danger and get out of combat as quickly as possible. So the fact that you actually get to fully use your entire class kit is an awesome learning experience that I think to some degree is somewhat missing from the regular questing of like War Within, for instance. I also think sometimes increased challenges can lead to increased enjoyment and fun of the content, but also you're more engaged with the content as well. Normally when you play WoW, you could just have Netflix on the other monitor or be watching a YouTube video, maybe one from this channel, while you're leveling a brand new character, which is just fun, but it just feels like you're just playing a waiting game and can be a bit monotonous. You're just waiting for you to finally hit the end game where you could finally start playing the real game for real. But the hard mode allows you a little bit more of this opportunity to start playing the real game immediately. Every level that you gain from difficult fights feels very rewarding, and doing content at max level also awards the end game rating gear as well, which is super fun and exciting. And I think a mode like this probably could be hugely beneficial when it comes to a retail version of WoW, maybe at some point in the future, but I think at the very least they're testing out the waters with the hero tier open world content with Legion Remix, and they potentially could transfer this type of a system to the modern game at some point in the future. And if they ever did, I definitely would be somebody who would support the decision wholeheartedly. But with that, as always, I don't want to thank all of you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys did enjoy the video. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give it a like, as I would very much appreciate it. Likes also help videos reach a wider audience, so it helps out the channel tremendously. Also, be sure to join our Discord community, especially if you want to keep up with any future content updates regarding Legion Remix or potentially Midnight Alpha, if we get some news on the horizon for that specifically. Very soon, we'll definitely be making a lot of posts and discussing all the new changes and updates with the community. Let me know all your thoughts in the comments down below, and as always, I'll see all of you guys in our next one.